All right, hello there. Very nice, very nice. Okay. Let me get all set up here. Hello, my name is John Major Spaulding. I'm an attorney and author in Houston, Texas, and I'm going to be reading to you today my very first book, Shield Sister. It's up for purchase here on the TikTok shop, and as part of the Black Friday Creator Series, I am going live on the first day possible. This is Shield Sister for Meredith, my sister. I'm going to read the author's note here because I've got plenty of time. This tale is a work of historical fiction with fantastical elements, and it's meant to be heard rather than read. While many of the events that take place in and around the story did occur, the characters in the story and the lives they lead are entirely fictional. The Spaulding clan did live in Angus, Scotland around the 15th century, but no descriptions of the events or places in this work of fiction should be treated as entirely accurate or factual. Furthermore, this story is filled with anachronisms. As people living in the 21st century, we will never be able to accurately depict what life was exactly like more than 600 years ago, and it is impossible to create anything close to realistic dialogue without using modern language. Despite the historical aspect of this book, the dialogue in this story is almost entirely in English, and it should be noted that people who lived in this time would have been speaking numerous languages in different dialects. I have been inspired by many great artists, but I must give credit to my friend Seth for being instrumental in the adventure that was writing these pages. I would like to extend a special thanks to Lexi, Debbie, Courtney, and every one of my family members for their patience in helping me, especially my wife, Rachel. Part 1, the year 1400. Chapter 1, a prophecy fulfilled. Push! Come now, push! The sounds from inside the room echoed down the hall and unnerved the men outside. Clad in fur cloaks and finery, they were patiently awaiting the birth of Peter's second child. When Peter was young, a pagan seer foretold that his second child would grow to be a famous warrior. Peter was jovial. He'd waited all his life for this moment. Peter Spaulding was a stout man. Black hair formed a semicircle around his bald head, and he had a thick red beard. He was boisterous in boast and bold in battle. Peter was named in honor of his grandfather, who brought the Spaulding clan to standing. His grandfather gained fame by helping Robert the Bruce take Berwick from the English. For his assistance, Bruce awarded the Spaulding clan some lands in Angus, so Peter considered himself a third-generation noble. He thought it was time to cement the clan's legacy as powerful warriors, so he couldn't help himself when his wife, Sarah, became pregnant with his second child. He told anyone and everyone that the child would be a boy, and that he would become a legendary hero against the English. He would raise this child to hate the English and kill them without mercy. Peter was eager to greet this warrior. Push! Push harder now! I can see the... The midwife was cut off by a blood-curdling scream. The men outside looked to Peter with wide eyes. His smile was gone, never to return. He turned and burst through the door, slamming it behind him. Peter charged down the hall. What's wrong with my son? The midwives didn't see him. Two checked on Sarah while the third cradled a bloody child. Sarah was not breathing. Well, is she all right? He was less concerned now that he'd seen his perfect progeny. A midwife turned to Peter with her eyes downcast. She shook her head and wept. At least my son has arrived. My second... Peter stopped as the midwife turned the front of a baby toward him. A blood-covered girl was wailing in her arms. No! She died bearing a girl? How cruel is our God! Peter stormed out of the room without a second look at the child. His first son was expecting him anxiously. Well, what happened? Hugh asked, nervous for his mother. Hugh was an inquisitive boy of 9. He loved his mother, but most importantly, he hated the English. He was fair-skinned and freckled. His hair was a fiery red that would shine in the sun, and he had a Pictish shape like his father. She's gone. The bairn's a girl. Find a wet nurse and bury her mother. I'll be back. Hugh, quietly devastated, whispered, "Yes, Father," and a tear ran down his face. Peter could hear the weakness in his voice and was disgusted. Hugh ran inside to meet his sister as Peter and the other nobles walked from the courtyard, mounted their horses, and rode off. Hugh greeted the midwives and held his now clean baby sister. He walked to his motionless mother and kissed her forehead. "Rest now, Mother. You can't suffer anymore." Hugh wished his father could show any sadness or offer some comfort, but Peter viewed women as a means to an end, and his wife could no longer create his living legacy. There would be a new woman soon, after his mother was placed in the ground. Hugh turned to the midwives. "Did my mother say what her name should be before she died?" The young midwife who first held the child nodded her head. "She shall be called Meredith, my lord." Hugh looked long and hard at Meredith. "Welcome to this world, Meredith. I like your red hair." Hugh turned again to the midwives. "Meredith will need a wet nurse, and I will need one of you to take care of her while I bury my mother." Two of the midwives said nothing but continued to weep. The young woman who first held Meredith spoke up again. "My name is Beth, my lord. I could be Meredith's nurse, and I'll take care of her. Your poor mum. She was so brilliant and sweet. Why would God take her from us?" Hugh said nothing and handed Meredith to Beth. Holding back a wave of tears, Hugh went looking for a spade. He walked out of the room and into the courtyard. Hugh found a spade easily enough and selected a soft spot behind their large estate. He began to dig. When Hugh was halfway finished with the grave, he broke down in tears. He didn't know Beth was watching from a window while Meredith slept. Beth had served the Spauldings long enough to know the type of men they could be, but her heart ached for this little boy. She was overcome with sadness watching Hugh dig his mother's grave. Any other noblewoman or wife of a lord would warrant a magnificent procession to be witnessed by every Spaulding subject, but Peter's disdain for the church precluded any possibility of celebrating Sarah's life in a public fashion. Sarah's faith in God had been unwavering, but Peter never shared her piety, and he consistently discouraged his wife and son's attendance in church. Now that Sarah was gone, Peter would only need the church to marry a new woman, much to the dismay of his servants and subjects. Beth held on to her memory of Sarah. She knew that Sarah was Hugh's only source of love or comfort, and now his life would take a dark turn. His father would show him nothing but violence. He would teach Hugh history, stories, and legends, but he would never teach Hugh how to love or how to feel. Peter couldn't teach Hugh those things because they were as foreign to him as the English. Hugh finished digging the grave and returned to where his mother died. The midwives had wrapped Sarah up in her bed sheets to cover her. Hugh was only 9, but he was already a force of brute strength. He picked up his mother's body in a fit of grief and rage and carried it to the spot he chose. Solemnly, Hugh placed his mother's corpse in the hole. He said a quiet prayer for her in Latin that he heard the priest say at a burial. Hugh could not read, but he knew enough of the Bible to say a few verses. The funeral was meek. Hugh couldn't help but think about how much more his mother deserved. There should have been dozens of people wailing and singing songs of her ascent to heaven. It was not to be. She would be forgotten by his father's unspoken command, and her memory would only live on through Hugh. Hugh resolved to tell his new sister everything about her mother, how she would laugh at his childish humor, and how she would tell stories of wizards and warriors before she would kiss him goodnight. His mother's eyes were green, and they gleamed like emeralds when she laid them on Hugh. They would shine no more, but Hugh wouldn't blame his mother's passing on Meredith. She was now the only thing Hugh had to remember his mother by, and he would protect her unto death. Hugh shoveled dirt into the hole to fill it. As he patted down the dirt and placed a meager cross on it to mark the grave, Hugh cried for the very last time. He would never allow himself to shed another tear. Hugh went back into the room and fell into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of wolves chasing him. Ever were they upon him, nipping at his heels and howling with delight in the hunt. He always woke up when they made their kill. When he awoke covered in sweat, he would run to his mother's room. No more. This time, Hugh ran to check on Meredith. She was sound asleep. Even as a baby, Meredith slept through the night. She looked peaceful and would whisper secrets as she slept. Who knows what knowledge she shared with the dark? Hugh dared not disturb her rest. He left Meredith to Beth's care and went to the yard to the train. Since Sarah had become pregnant with his second child, Peter had ignored Hugh. Hugh knew he should have been training with weapons, but his father could not find the time or the desire. The grounds of the clan estate had no men-at-arms like some English castle, and there were no idle men to train a boy. Fathers taught their sons how to fight, how to kill. Hugh learned how to fight from his friends, the children of the Spalding subjects who lived on the estate. They all were young and hard-headed. Each was eager and willing to scrap with no thought of injury. Teaching one another's Celtic martial arts was simple. Tripping your opponents and learning to wrestle are valuable skills, but boys aren't born with the knowledge to do death. When Hugh was smaller, his father would tell him great tales and sagas of heroes. Peter would tell him about his own battles and the battles of his grandfathers. Peter would scold Hugh that you don't fight your enemies, you kill them. And Peter would describe in graphic detail the few but impressive victories he'd earned. He told Hugh that he was fighting for Scotland, and Scotland was all. Hugh was a little wiser now, and those words didn't ring true to him anymore. Scotland was not all for Peter. Peter's only loyalty was to his legacy and how it would compare with his forebears. Hugh told himself that he would always be loyal, but he would never be the same kind of man as his father. Still, Hugh aimed to make Peter proud. Nothing pained Hugh more than disappointing his father. He hoped Peter would come home that morning and see him training alone. It was to be. Hugh could hear several horsemen come up the drive. He swung his wooden sword intently at the straw man he'd fashioned. He could hear a woman's laugh but didn't recognize her voice. He kept on swinging. More laughs. Then he heard his father's voice. "Welcome to your new home. What do you think?" "Oh, the tower is so tall, I think we should live in the clouds." "That's what we'll call it then, the clouds." "Peter, I love that. I cannot wait to see inside." He didn't care to meet this woman. No one would replace this mother. Hugh was swinging harder than he ever had before now, desperate to be noticed by his father. Hugh's effort was wasted. Peter took the woman inside without seeing Hugh. Covered in sweat, Hugh dropped his wooden sword by the straw man. He trudged to the door of his tower home and followed his father inside. The tower, now named the Clouds, was made of stone stacked 3 stories high. The stonemasons of Angus were fine craftsmen and built a handsome tower that gave advantage over the farming settlements of Ballarty. There were no such structures anywhere close by, so the Clouds was a landmark. Hugh would often stare at the Spalding crest on the flag at the top of the tower. The sigil of his house was a portcullis gate with some words inscribed above it. Hugh couldn't read the words, but he knew they were written in Latin, and they meant noble in service. Hugh strived to be noble in his service to his father and to Scotland. After centuries of English invasion, Hugh prayed for a chance to win glory against the English. Hugh had been close to the truth. Peter brought home Elise. She was standing in the dining room with Peter. She marveled at the Spalding clan's tapestries that were draped from spears placed horizontally on the wall. Then she noticed Hugh and seized her chance to make a good impression. "Hello, Hugh. I've heard much about you from your wonderful father." She smiled and her blue eyes twinkled. Her hair was yellow and she was fair-skinned. She had a pretty face, but Hugh tried to look at the floor. I'm Hugh. And you are?" "My name is Elise, but I think a boy your age should call me mother," she replied sweetly. Peter looked at Hugh and knew that would never happen. He changed the subject. "Elise is here to feed you and take care of you while I'm away and to better my children. Be kind to her. Do as she says or answer to me." Hugh nodded and accepted his fate. His sense of duty was his least favorite quality. Hugh said quietly, "Meredith's in her room if you wish to see her." "So it's Meredith, eh? I'll see her after I show Elise about the tower and grounds." Peter took tall Elise upstairs and lay with her. He didn't go to see Meredith after. Whenever he would go to her room, Peter would pick Meredith up in his arms and feel the sting of Sarah's loss. It pained him, but not as much as the fact that Meredith was a girl. Meredith was a constant reminder of the seer's prophecy, and Peter could never love her as a daughter. He was still convinced his second son would grow to be a powerful warrior. Peter and Elise tried to have children, but Elise could not conceive. Despite his lack of faith, Peter took Elise to every priest and pagan shaman in Angus, But even the old Norse gods would not put a baby in Elise's belly. Over time, Elise lost any desire she had for children and replaced it with a craving for her own visage. If she could not produce Peter's children, she would be his trophy and his lust. For some time, Peter was content to look upon Elise's beauty. He married her as soon as the church would allow, but beauty is never enough. After a few short years, Peter was bored with Elise, and Elise knew it. She would spend inordinate amount of time making herself look beautiful just to recapture the feelings of intimacy they had when they first met. All the while, Meredith grew. As a child, Meredith's favorite word was nay. Beth and Hugh would try to put a smile on her face, but Meredith would shout, "Nay!" and giggle mercilessly at their reactions. Peter and Elise were satisfied to keep each other's company, and they did all they could to pretend Meredith never existed. This became much more difficult when Meredith could walk, run, and ask questions. After Beth's services as a wet nurse were finished, most of Meredith's questions were directed to Elise, annoying Elise to no end. Peter and Hugh would occasionally be called to fight in Scotland's defense for months at a time, and during those times, Meredith stayed in the tower with Elise. Elise was Meredith's source of food, and Meredith was fond of Elise until one day when they were alone, and Meredith asked about her mother. "Are you me mummy?" "I am not, child." "Your husband is my da." "Yes, he is." "Who are you if you're not me mummy?" "I'm your da's wife." "You said mummy was da's wife." Elise failed to restrain herself, and her self-contempt became a spectacle as she harangued Meredith. Elise's eyes went wide, and her anemic frame shook. "Listen, you wee cow. Your mummy is dead. She's never coming back. Your father loves me and only me. You're nothing to him. You'll always be nothing." After that exchange, Elise grew a taste for harassing her stepchild. She would find ways to step on Meredith's spirits whenever she saw that Meredith was the slightest pleased about something. Elise would go especially out of her way to dash Meredith's dreams when Peter was near. To add to Meredith's misery, Peter would not allow Elise's behavior. It would not only allow Elise's behavior, he seemed to enjoy it. Despite Elise's efforts, Meredith never submitted. She would defiantly place her hands on her hips and look Elise right in the eyes. She didn't say anything when Elise would puff up and say horrible things, but Meredith would stare Elise down. Meredith would smirk when Elise gave up and walked away in a huff. She loved to win. And there was no sweeter joy than agitating her pitiless stepmother. The only thing that came close was attacking her balding older brother. Meredith frequently threw herself at Hugh. Now a grown man, he was a little taller than his father, but his gut was still no match. Hugh's back was solid and his shoulders wide. His short arms and legs had little definition but were dense with muscle. Meredith lived for the moment she would sneak attack Hugh in the crotch or jump on his back from the stairs. Hugh was gifted with patience and never became angry with Meredith. He was always impressed by her instinct. Even as a child, Meredith was cunning. She would snoop through her family's things looking for anything secret, anything out of place. She would find proof of things unknown and keep it locked up in her head to reveal it when the moment was right. Meredith was stubborn and spiteful. Whenever Peter would deign to speak to her, it was to give a command, but Meredith didn't take commands. She gave them. Her hair was bright auburn. Her eyes were an unwavering dark brown, and they demanded answers. She would never break eye contact first, making other children nervous. One evening when Meredith was 6, Peter and Hugh were dining at a table in the hall that made up most of the tower's bottom floor. Meredith clambered up on the seat next to her father and sat down with a big sigh. To Meredith's glee, her father regarded her with a smile as he offered her a bite to eat. Her heart burned with the desire to be loved, and this tiny gesture was a small light in a lonely life. Elise walked in from the kitchen to see the warmth in their exchange, and she resolved to dash it immediately. "Meredith, will you please move so I can sit next to your father?" "Nay," peeped Meredith, smiling her dangerous smile. Elise compensated for her lack of control over her stepchildren with overt affection towards Peter. Elise attempted once more as her faux smile faded, and she said through gritted teeth, "Meredith, I'm always by his side. I must be near my husband." Meredith said again, "Nay!" Elise exclaimed, "Peter!" He sighed, "Meredith, you can't sit here. Elise sits here." "She can sit there. I want to sit next to my da." Being disobeyed was unfamiliar to Peter, but this was amusing to him. He let it go on a little longer. "And why should I want to sit next to you?" Meredith was stunned for the first time, but she recovered quickly. Because I'm your daughter and you want to sit with me. Peter laughed but did not smile. His wrath would follow if he were not quickly obeyed. Nay, I do not. Move now. Elise grinned in victory. She couldn't wait for Meredith's joy to shrivel and die. Meredith turned to her father in hope. Da? Do you love me? Hugh stopped eating and eyeballed his father. The room waited for an answer. Peter said, Nay, I do not. You killed your mother. Peter didn't lie about not loving her, but he lied about why. He would never tell his wife or his son Meredith's existence was an embodiment of all of his disappointment and failure. Meredith reminded Peter of Sarah and how little he felt at her death. Peter knew a few years of guilt for his actions that night. He'd been sleeping with Elise for a year before Sarah died, and he planned to bring Elise into the house after his second child was born anyway. Meredith never failed to remind him of his unfaithfulness. Meredith wasn't finished. Her eyes were fixed on Peter's. Peter broke their eye contact dismissively. I said, move, girl. His voice almost burst her eardrum. Meredith began to cry and cry loudly. She was still a little girl, and she ran upstairs to her room in a haze of tears. If her father didn't love her, then she wouldn't love him either. Hugh was kind to her, but not in front of their father. When Peter was in the room, Hugh spoke only when spoken to, and when Elise or Peter would denigrate Meredith, he was useless. She resolved to rely only on herself. She wiped the tears from her eyes and found the hole in her heart where love should have been. She poured her feelings of scorn and spite into that hole until it overflowed. Meredith became grim and brooding. She began to sleep until noon each day. Hatred for her stepmother and father consumed her thoughts for years until she was old enough to leave the estate on her own. Elise and Peter could never tell Meredith what to do, so Hugh was her de facto guardian. Hugh thought it was safe enough for Meredith to go into Billerty alone when she was 10 years old. All the time, the local children seemed to be playing some sort of sport. Whether it was the ball game or football, there was never an end to the activities. The children of the town would play every day from midday to dusk, and Meredith was no exception. 2 older boys would declare themselves leader of the teams and drafted their players accordingly. It was tradition that Meredith be chosen last. They would make a big show of it as if it were a complete revelation that she was even waiting to be chosen. She never cared. Even though the older children would tease her for her red hair or for living in the tower, none of them could stand up to her in a fight. The oldest among them was a 13-year-old yellow-haired shite who tried to put Meredith in her place on the first day they met. Meredith laughed when he tried to trip her. She grabbed his throat with her left hand and held it while she punched both of his eyes black with her right. He never tried to goad her again. One afternoon when the sun was low in the sky, Meredith went to play football in the town. She hollered to Hugh, who was training in the yard like always. Hugh was surprised because he expected her to already be out and about. Taking a break from his regimen, Hugh walked slowly and out of sight behind her as she made her way down the dirt drive. Meredith met up with several boys and girls at the edge of town and ran with them to the field where they played every day. After they picked teams, the game started in a whirlwind of sprinting and screaming. Hugh propped himself against a tree near the field, no longer concealing himself. Hugh watched for half an hour before he felt satisfied with Meredith's unusually late activity. He was about to head back home when the ball was lost in a large struggle. Meredith was 10 steps away from the scrum and charged headlong into it. Hugh watched in disbelief as Meredith used her shoulders to bowl over the boys and girls around the ball until she came away with it. She dribbled down the field with separating speed. Before she made her moment count, she stopped on a dime. An old woman had come in between her and the goal, and for a moment the game was forgotten. Meredith kicked the ball at the goal and didn't watch as it sailed in between the trees they used as goalposts. She was already in her classic stance, hands on her hips, legs spread, looking right into the eyes of this old woman. The woman seemed ancient to Meredith. Her skin was spotted and wrinkled, and her hair was a matted mess. The woman's nose was sharp, and some of her teeth were missing. She held an oak branch like a walking stick in her left hand, and pointed her right forefinger at Meredith's nose. The other children fled the field in terror of the old woman. They knew who she was, but Meredith didn't fear anyone. Hugh looked on in awe as Meredith faced her down. You, wanderer, widowmaker, warrior, it is you, Mary Death. How do you know my name? I have seen things, Mary Death. She laughed naughtily. Well, what do you know? I'm not afraid of you. The old woman grinned a toothy grin. You, my child of fire, my bringer of doom, you shall deal death and justice and mighty vengeance long before fear finds your heart. Hugh walked over to Meredith and the woman to see just what was going on. He was flabbergasted from what he saw Meredith do to her friends. Hugh began to understand what Meredith could be, and he felt foolish for not noticing before. Meredith, we best be getting home. Let's not disturb this nice, lady. Nay, I want to hear what she has to say. The old woman was already walking back into the woods when Meredith turned back around. Wait, what did you mean by those things? The old woman didn't turn. The prophecy will be fulfilled. You will find me when you stop looking. She disappeared into the woods and seemed to vanish amongst the dark contours. Meredith had 100 questions, but she knew Hugh didn't know the answer to any of them. She wanted to follow the woman, but she couldn't see her anymore. Hugh broke the silence. What the blazes was that? Meredith responded, I've not an idea. Me neither, but I do have an idea about what you did to those poor kids. You're special, Meredith. I've never seen a girl with your kind of strength before. Meredith rolled her eyes. Qualified compliments bothered her, but she kept listening. I think you could learn to fight like we fight. I'll teach you, to kill. Maybe you could be a shield maiden like the Danes had. Meredith liked the sound of that. Fighting came as naturally to her as breathing. She figured being trained by her brother meant she would learn to use weapons. Meredith thought about taking her father's claymore to Elise's neck. Then she remembered the stories Hugh would tell her as a child, and a big smirk of determination spread across her face. I will nae be a shield maiden. Oh, eh? I'm gonna be a Valkyrie. Thanks for joining the live, guys. Again, my name is John Spalding. I'm the author of this book, Shield Sister. This is chapter 2, Like Water. Wake up, little girl! Meredith dreamt of war and wrath and had tossed about in her sleep. She would always wake up in strange positions on different sides of the bed on which she slept. This time, she was on her stomach with her arms and legs outstretched to her sides. Hugh knew it would take more than one alarm to wake her. It's time to get your sodding ass out of bed, you little ginger! Meredith opened one eye and spat. Piss off! I need my beauty sleep. If sleep gives you beauty, then you should be the most beautiful girl in the world, Hugh laughed. He knew she was beautiful, but nobody ever told her so. Wee bugger, what do you want? Hugh didn't waste any time. He raised a wooden waster sword and brought it down with a hard smack on her bottom. Yow! Ow! I'm awake! Get up then, and put this on. Hugh dropped a heavy black gambeson on her bed. It would prevent many of the bruises she would earn in training. Hugh walked out of the room and let her get dressed. Meredith got out of bed, thoroughly angry. If training meant she could fight Hugh all day, then she was ready for it. She put on the gambeson. It draped down to her mid-thigh like an oversized shirt, and her arms were short for it. She rolled up the sleeves to her wrists and put on winter gloves. Meredith saw how many fingers Hugh broke in training, and she wouldn't make the same mistake. She threw on her boots and left the room. Meredith ran down the tower steps towards the smell of ham. Elise and Peter were sitting at the table eating. Good morning, Da. Morning, Elise. Any ham left? Peter didn't look up. No, your brother shoved it in all his mouth on the way outside. Elise added, You don't need any more pork, little piggy. She pulled up the tip of her nose to resemble a pig and snorted at Meredith viciously. Peter chuckled and returned to their previous conversation. So, you were in France before you came to Edinburgh? Oui, oui, mon ami, Elise replied in what was clearly the only French she could speak. She glanced at Meredith to make sure what she was watching and batted her long eyelashes at Peter. Oh la la! Peter moved in to kiss her, and she pounced on him. Elise's antics were the epitome of high drama. She would create a big fuss about something Meredith said or did, and deliver the news to Peter while bawling. As Meredith got older, Elise started to dangle Peter in front of her, like a child refusing to share a toy, but Meredith was only appalled by it. She acted like she couldn't care less. Meredith opened the door to the courtyard and stepped outside to be Hugh for eating all the ham. It wouldn't be the first time she'd done it. She walked into the courtyard expecting Hugh to be in the corner in which she lived. She didn't see him or hear anything but the wind and birds. Then something took out her legs from under her, and she hit the ground with a thud. Meredith was flat on her back, writhing in pain. She could see stars moving around the blue sky, and then Hugh poked his head into view. "First things first, lass. Expect the unexpected." "I expected you to eat all the food." She reached for his legs, but he was too quick. "And I expected you to come outside and hit me for it. But here you are, dead." She rolled to her side and pushed herself up. "What? What are you saying?" "You were going to hit me for spanking you in your room and for scarfing the ham, right? Naturally, the first place you'd look is where I always am, over there in the corner by the straw men." "And?" Meredith became frustrated by the explanation. The fire of her anger kindled. She just wanted to hit him back and hit him hard. Hugh sighed. He knew Meredith was smart enough to understand what he was trying to teach her. She was so stubborn and quick to anger that her judgment was clouded. Meredith telegraphed an imminent attack with her eyes. She lunged at him with a right hook. He ducked underneath her swing, stuck out his foot, and pushed her over it. Meredith fell into the grass and her mouth filled with dirt. It was her first encounter with Celtic martial arts. Hugh took his waster sword up with both hands and thrice struck her on the bottom. "Stop spanking me right now! Shite!" "Do you know why you died?" Hugh asked, still trying to avoid spoon-feeding her. Meredith racked her brain for the answer Hugh wanted. She tried to remember the times she would creep on the tower stairs to listen to Peter and Hugh discussing current events or wars to come. Meredith loved to listen to the songs of swords and sorrow they would sing by the fireside. They would share the few war stories they had between them often enough, but Meredith liked to hear about the tournaments and the melee. They discussed clan business together too, and she knew they had plans to become mercenaries in France if the newly crowned King of England crossed the Channel. Meredith stood up, having learned her first lesson. She was ready for more, and ready to hit Hugh back. She went on. "You knew how to make me chase you outside, and I knew I would attack you after you knocked me down. I died because I was led into a trap." "Yes, Meredith, exactly." She asked, "Is that the whole lesson then?" "This is the lesson. All warfare is deception. In your mind, there should be no difference between a fight amongst two men or two armies. The battle is always won before the clash of swords. Do you understand?" "I think so. You're saying just now you beat me before you hit me?" He said, "Aye. You lost before you even woke up this morning. Every moment happened just like I planned it, but you didn't plan anything. You just reacted." "How was I supposed to plan anything? You screamed me ears off and ate all the ham." Yes, I did. Do you understand why?" "Because I would run outside and hit you." "Right again." "Okay, but how did you know I would do those things?" "Because I know you, Meredith. You must know yourself. Once you know who you are, you can learn who your enemies are." Meredith's face darkened. "I have a mind for who my enemies are." "Aye, but do you know your enemies? Could you trap them as I trapped you?" She paused for a moment to think about it. "Probably not." "Well, there's plenty of time for that later. Now that you understand a bit of the fundamentals, we can start with the physical training." He raised his waster sword high in the air again. Meredith raised her arms in an X to block the blow. He stepped forward with his left foot and jabbed her hard in the stomach with his left hand. Meredith doubled over in pain and looked up at Hugh, who was grinning like an idiot. "Lesson learned?" She spat. "Aye, sawed off." Meredith seethed with rage. She thought about trying to pummel Hugh again, but remembered how the dirt tasted. She allowed herself to calm down and tried to comprehend the lesson. Every word Hugh said to her that morning was true, but his actions were false. His eyes lied with each movement he made, and each time Meredith watched them, she was fooled. She understood the teaching and was in awe of her brother's wisdom. That wouldn't stop her from giving him a taste of his own medicine. Hugh watched her carefully. Meredith's tendency was to strike out when she was in a fey mood. She had him where she wanted him. "There's just one more thing I dinna understand," she said. Hugh saw the fire in her eyes and knew another attack was imminent. He would punish her like he did before. "And what's that?" She balled her right hand into a fist and took a big step forward with her left foot as if to throw another hook. Hugh was already moving underneath her punch when she altered her motion together and high-kicked him squarely in the jaw with her right foot. Hugh's brain crashed against the walls of his skull and he fell unconscious. Meredith stood over him for a moment, afraid she'd killed her older brother. He rolled over in a daze and groaned. "See? I'm a grown man. I fought and killed. You're gonna be great at this." Hugh handed Meredith his wooden waster sword. She liked the feel of the weight in her hands, but she wanted to train with bladed weapons. "When do I get to use a real sword? Can't I swing Da's claymore?" "You think I'd give you a real sword? So you can kill Elise and Da while they sleep?" Meredith didn't see anything wrong with that, and in fact she thought it was a pretty good idea. "Well, no, but I want to learn." "You need to learn some control first. New recruits die all too often when weapons are thrust into their hands before they're ready. Now run over to those dummies and practice swinging that waster. I'm going to take a moment to pick myself up." Meredith sprinted at the dummies like a demon. She slid into a stance and swung the waster as hard as she could, over and over. She pounded the straw with different swings. High-low, low-high, side cut, diagonal slash, low-high from the other side, stab, 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 decapitate. Hugh took much longer to shake himself off than he expected. Meredith's kick had knocked him out cold. Hugh remembered that she was still only 10 years old and just a child. He felt sorry for anyone who crossed her. Hugh walked over to the corner of the courtyard where Meredith was mauling the poor straw men. Her form was good. She knew how to transfer her weight and put force behind each blow. Meredith kept swinging until her arms felt like they would fall off. She looked up to find the sun, but felt surprised it wasn't midday yet. Meredith would have sworn she'd been hitting those straw men for hours. She took a step back and said to her brother, "I can barely move my arms. How do you do this all day?" "Because I've been doing this all day since before you were born. Your muscles will grow accustomed to it if you practice every day. Fighting for your life is terribly exhausting, Meredith, and time seems to move slower in the heat of battle. If you want to live, then your muscles need to work when you call on them." "That makes sense, I guess." "Aye, it does. When you're moving and fighting, no two situations will ever be the same. You've got to fill the void in the shape of the container. You understand?" No. "You've got to flow like water, Meredith." "But what does that mean?" "You'll know soon enough. Ready to learn something else?" She nodded her head and Hugh taught her a new exercise until she mastered it. They went on, running about all day doing different isometric exercises and learning wrestling moves until Meredith was exhausted and ready to quit. Hugh was extremely pleased with the progress she'd made, but there was much more to teach, and always more to learn. After their training session was complete, and Hugh was satisfied with how much Meredith had to eat, she would go up to her room and lock the door. Each night, Meredith would throw a makeshift rope of clothing out of the bedroom window and climb down to the ground. She would sneak off the estate and head into the woods where she first saw the old woman who had said such strange things to her. Meredith would search for her for hours. And every night, Meredith would find nothing and no one. For years this went on. Hugh would wake up Meredith in the morning and spar with her and make her drill until he thought she couldn't continue. He would teach her how to hold a spear and shoot arrows with a bow. Then he would show her how to use a buckler in one hand and a sword in the other. Meredith excelled at all of these, but none better than when Hugh brought out a blunted two-handed longsword. Meredith's center of gravity was such that she could maneuver the blade hither and thither without putting all her effort into each swing. Even Hugh thought twice before sparring against her when she grasped a sword with both hands. Hugh taught Meredith some military history. He showed her the way of ancient battles were won and lost, in which generals were famous for their triumphs and their disasters. Hugh even told Meredith about the famous battles won by the English against the French. She found it odd how impressed Hugh seemed with the English use of peasant archers against French knights. He might have hated the English, but he clearly respected their martial prowess. By age 13, Meredith was finished growing and yet still unblooded. Her arms were powerful, and her broad shoulders bore ample breast. Her legs and bottom were sinewy with wide hips, but she had grown into the picture shape of her father and brother. Meredith was bodacious in her strength, and the teenage boys of Ballarty lusted after her as much as they feared her. Meredith was not to be trifled with, and many men would learn the hard way. One midnight, Meredith stalked the forest for the old woman. The wind blew briskly and whistled through the forest, kicking up leaves. Pale moonlight exposed her as she moved between trees. This night was different than the others, however. Meredith stopped in her tracks, exhausted from repeating the same search every night. She shouted to the wind, "Fine! I'm finished!" Meredith turned around to head home when suddenly a young man emerged from cover. "Evening, lass. Where you going?" She recognized him. He was a tall brunette and one of the fools she'd run over playing footy years ago. "Home!" She ran away as fast as she could. Meredith knew she could handle herself, but tried to give the boy a chance. He took off after her. She sprinted hard back the way she came, but as she passed a large tree, another boy jumped out and hit her with a wide tree branch. She was dazed, and the boys quickly tied her to the nearest tree. Meredith regained clarity in a few minutes later, as the boys were arguing. Her head was throbbing something awful, and she realized her predicament. The boys' voices were raised, and to Meredith they seemed to be debating who would get to go first, and were no longer paying close attention to their prey. Luckily, they hadn't searched her very well. She was able to bring her right foot back behind her. Meredith reached desperately for the dirk she kept hidden in her boot. Hugh had given it to her for her birthday. He told her it was the same dirk their mother had given him. Meredith managed to reach the knife. It had a well-crafted handle, and the double-edged geometry of the blade carved through the ropes without trouble. She loved the idea that she was about to fend off her attackers with a gift from her mother. Quickly, Meredith ducked behind the same tree she was tied to. She decided she wouldn't run away from these fools and waited for the boys to realize she was gone before making her move. To her delight, one of them exclaimed, "Oh, shite! Where'd she go?" She came out from behind the tree. "Oh, are you lads looking for me?" They froze in their tracks and looked at each other. Meredith tucked her hands behind her back and walked towards them slowly. She held the dirk in her right hand, pointing the tip at the ground. Meredith spoke coyly. "Did you bastards think you were going to have some fun tonight?" "Aye, you're ready for a go or two. Let's see about that ginger minge, eh?" Meredith forced a snort of laughter and pondered their demise. She would fool them with her eyes. She used her left hand to tug at the neckline of her black gambeson as she continued meandering towards them. The boy who hit her with the branch stood behind the other, realizing he'd become the prey. It occurred to Meredith that he would run if she killed the tall one. She relished her moment. "The ting is, you scroats, I'm not who you're looking for," she said as she flashed the dirk to grab their focus. "Oh yeah? We found you all right." The boy in back retreated a few steps in fear of her blade, but the tall brunette scoffed at his cowardice and stood his ground. Meredith locked eyes with him. Her soft lips formed a scowl, and her voice became dark and deep and terrible. "What were you thinking to do with me? Thinking of having a little fun? Thinking of finding a nice girl and taking whatever you wanted? Taking whatever you think you're owed?" The cocksure grin on the brunette's face vanished, and the only thing he showed was fear. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down from a woman. He widened his stance to dodge an attack. A fury blazed in Meredith's eyes, and she raised her dirk high in the moonlight. Transfixed on the blade, the brunette didn't see Meredith's leg wind up to deliver a crushing kick to his crotch. He fell to his knees in agony and dry heaved. Meredith grabbed him by the hair on his head and whispered, "Let me give you what you deserve." She slit his neck open with a savage motion. The other boys screamed in horror and fled. There could be no tales of a red-headed girl killing a local boy, and she didn't waste a second. She threw her dirk with precision, and it slammed into her target. He fell, mortally wounded. Meredith swaggered over to the second person she would ever kill, and with a twist, pulled the knife out of his back. Meredith's blood was hot. She felt more alive and more confident in herself than she ever had. She could feel her heart pounding with excitement in the kill, but something was wrong. Meredith knew she should have felt something other than complete and total joy. For the first time in her life, Meredith felt a rush of defying death, and for a sweet, solitary moment, she forgot her name and where she was. Meredith longed for her life to be somewhere else, somewhere far away where she could feel like this forever. She left the bodies of her attackers where they fell and began the long walk home. In skaldic fashion, Meredith sang in victory. Looking for a friend in the night, they flashed their grins with teeth so white, jumped from cover to give her fright, but they were too focused on the knife. It was early morning, hours before dawn. A thick fog swept across the hills and slanted glens of Ballarty. Meredith moved unseen. She crept onto the back of her father's land through the woods and trudged home. She walked half a mile before she came to the hill where the clouds sat. She hated it when Elise called the tower that. Whenever they hosted families to dinner or met people in public, Elise would rant and rave about how lovely it was to live in the clouds. Everything in the clouds was perfect, and nothing could possibly compare to the stone fortifications, the tapestries, and the meager fence around it. It was all such a dream. Meredith loathed Elise for how utterly false she was. The clouds was just a tower where she was forced to watch her life slip by as she waited to be married off. Meredith would run away before she let that happen. She began the short hike up the hill. The sun was not yet rising, but the darkness bolted from the earth. Meredith had never taken so long to come home before, and she worried Hugh was searching for her. Something else tickled the back of her mind. Meredith knew she was being watched. Realizing there could be a reprisal for the boys, she twirled around in an instant.
Hell hath claimed 2 souls tonight. Merry death.
Meredith was face to face with the old woman and had forced herself from flinching out of surprise. Still, Meredith was glad to finally find the old woman. They didn't deserve to be in heaven with my mother.
Your mother's not in heaven, child. She fights and dies and feasts in Valhalla.
Valhalla's not real. She was a Christian, and she confessed with her mouth that Christ is Lord. The old woman laughed warmly, and life flushed back into her clouded gray eyes. Her matted hair seemed to lose its static. She grabbed Meredith by the hand. Who are you to deny it? This very hour, the whole of Valhalla sings songs in your praise. Meredith didn't know much of Norse lore or their pantheon. Hugh told her of the saga of King Harold and the tales of Ragnar Lothbrok. Meredith especially related to Grettir's saga and his bad luck. As for gods, Hugh told the occasional story about Thor and his mighty hammer, but Hugh didn't like telling stories about other gods because he feared blasphemy. Meredith liked the idea of an afterlife of warriors cheering her on through a dark reality.
Come with me, girl. I have seen your life. I know who you are, what you were, and what you will be. Your journeys will take you far, my Valkyrie.
Meredith heard the end rhyme on Valkyrie and giggled. She took a moment to think about Hugh and what he would think when she was gone. She knew Peter and Elise would never notice. Feck it! Where are we going?
What if I told you we were going to meet Odin Allfather, to meet Thor?
Those people from the children's stories?
I did not come to tell you stories, Merry Death. Walk with me.
She led Meredith away from her father's land, through hills and trees until they came into a great plain, and in the middle of the plain stood a solitary oak tree, dead and lifeless. Meredith looked for the sun to rise, but time seemed to stand still as they walked towards the tree. The sky darkened quickly, and crows flocked to the plain. Storm clouds gathered over their heads as the crows, one by one, surrounded them. The crows' cawing was deafening. The cacophony grew and grew. Rain started falling slowly and then developed into a downpour. The matriarch grabbed Meredith by both hands near the dead oak tree and looked deeply into her eyes. They had to yell to hear one another. Do you know your mother's clan? Do you know her sigil? No, my brother never told me about their sigil. Her clan was from Ireland, and their sigil was a proud oak tree on a field of white. How do you know that? How do you know me? I've known you, fire child, since the gods gave me sight. The sky crackled overhead with lightning. A small burst of thunder followed. The gods have shown me your path of fury and flame.
They've asked me to introduce you.
Introduce me to the gods?
Introduce you to their names and introduce you to their games.
Well, where are they then? Aren't they coming to meet me?
They know your worth. Have no fear. Why do you search? They're already here.
A huge streak of lightning appeared across the sky behind the matriarch, and roaring thunder came with it. The surge of thunder startled the murder of crows, and they took to flight in the dense rain, flying this way and that with no sense of cohesion. They flew closely around Meredith and the seer.
Do you see now, Meredith? Odin's birds will follow you until your final breath. You will make your enemies bleed. Thor swings Mjolnir to commemorate your deeds. The gods are watching the stories you create and inspire. You will baptize the vainglorious sins of your fathers in hellfire. Remember this, my child so dear. None of your weapons are greater than fear.
With that, the seer disappeared into the rain and flapping of crows' wings. From the middle of the dead oak tree, a bolt of lightning raced high into the sky and tore the tree asunder. The blast from the shock knocked Meredith off her feet, and she landed on her back, unconscious. Meredith lay damaged on her back in the rain. She moved her head left and right, dreaming, seeing something. Then her vision was clear, and she saw a great gathering of people in banners. Meredith could see herself among them, but she was wearing armor. The carnival flew by, and in an instant, she was in a great forest. She was aiming a short bow at a deer. Then Meredith saw a great host of men and tents. Next, an ocean and a castle. Meredith's vision became a field of mud, encircled by trees with great hosts of men arrayed against another. And fire. Everywhere there was fire, but she was unburnt and still felt cold. Meredith was on a mountain, in the clouds, and then passing through the cities. Her path moved toward the rising sun, and she found herself in a metropolis under siege. Hundreds of thousands of men moved against the massive city, and she stood firm in defense. Meredith slayed men by the dozens and laughed as she slew. Still on the ground in the field, Meredith's face broke out into a smile. She woke up. After struggling to her feet, Meredith bore witness to the dozens of crows killed by the shockwave. It was no longer raining, and the sun had come out. She grasped all that had happened and questioned her sanity. Then she questioned her God. Meredith shook herself off and thought, I need some more fucking sleep. And she began the journey home. Meredith finally reached her tower home at midday, and no one was there. She went searching for food. Meredith took a plate of cheese and bread up to her room, wolfed it down, and fell asleep. Her dreams were disappointing. She wanted to have more visions of herself in strange places. When she awoke, the sky was dark. She could hear Peter and Hugh singing their songs of war. At least sang along sometimes, but couldn't hold a note. She was singing tonight, and it was especially dreadful. Her warbling prevented Meredith from falling back asleep, so she got out of bed to eat again. She went down the steps and into the den, where the three others were singing and sitting around the fire. Elise saw her and stopped singing. Peter and Hugh followed suit and looked to Meredith. Elise quivered as she started in,
Where have you been, young lady?
I was out.
Well, your father and your brother, and especially I, have been worried sick about you. We saw your string of clothes from your window and thought you ran away.
Peter looked nervously at Hugh. Hugh crossed his arms and pursed his lips. He'd heard enough and spoke up. Da, you told me Meredith was playing footy in town. What does she mean by the string of clothes and running away? Elise spoke for him.
We didn't want you to worry for her.
Hugh shouted back, You didn't want me to think she ran away because I would have gone after her. Peter jumped in before it got any worse. No, son. We wouldn't do that. We knew she would be back. Did not speak to your stepmother that way. Hugh slumped in his seat. Yes, father. This was the first time Meredith had seen Hugh even try to stick up for her, and she loved him for it. She grabbed another plate of cheese and bread and sat down by Hugh. Hugh changed the subject and asked Peter a question. So, when's the tourney in Edinburgh? Meredith's ears perked up as she ate. A fortnight? Why? Are they having a melee for the pages? Peter looked puzzled. Yes, but you're too old. You've already killed men that could have won that melee single-handedly. Why do you want to know about it? Hugh grinned and looked at Meredith. Oh, no reason. It's just fun to watch. Are we both tilting this year? Aye, we are. And this year we'll win the lists. Peter and Hugh were nobles and could participate in the jousting lists. They were fair horsemen, but their arm strength and two-handed weapons were wasted on horseback. They preferred to fight on foot in real battle, but they weren't keen on the knightly melee. They considered jousting to be a sport, but pretending to capture other knights for ransom was lackluster. On the battlefield, they wouldn't capture their enemies, but killed them outright. They did, however, enjoy spectating the melee and the chaos of it all. Meredith thought of her vision and the carnival she'd witnessed. She chimed in. Can I come to the tourney this year? Nay, Meredith. I haven't the energy to mind you and still win the lists. Come on, I nearly asked you for nothing. Hugh joined in, chuckling. Yeah, we should bring the whole family. Elise can come too to watch her husband win the lists. Elise smiled at the mention of her name. Oh, can we all come? It would be so wonderful. Once Elise wanted something, Peter set out to give it to her, and the plans were arranged. Meredith would travel with them to the tourney of Edinburgh in a fortnight's time. She lay awake in her bed that night, wondering of the things to come. She remembered wearing armor and the vision she had, and then she knew. It was the reason Hugh smiled at her and asked if she could come along. Meredith became ecstatic at the idea of testing her mettle against the witless pages of noble knights. She knew she would dominate them. Now, confident in her abilities and in her skill, Meredith slept heavily and without a care. The next morning, Hugh crept into Meredith's room. He held an old steel helm 6 inches above her head and dropped it on her face. Ow! What the fuck is wrong with you? Get up, little Valkyrie. You missed a whole day of training yesterday, and today you're gonna pay for it. Not as much as you're gonna pay for what you just did. Meredith got up and chased Hugh out of her room and down the steps. She flew after him as she barely escaped the tower and into the courtyard. She ran outside and tripped over something metal, and she slid face first on the ground for a few feet. Ow! What the fuck is happening to me? Hugh laughed until he couldn't breathe. The metal she tripped over was a breastplate and a set of greaves. Hugh dropped the helmet from before and a pair of small gauntlets next to them. Meredith held her shins in pain. What's all this shite? Congratulations, Meredith. You're the only girl in Scotland with a set of plate armor. Thanks for joining, guys. Again, my name is John Spalding. I'm reading my book, Shield Sister, and I'm on Chapter 3, Dreadnought. Meredith felt like she was dying. Each breath was a misery. The sun was high in the sky, and Meredith couldn't take another step. She begged for respite in between labored breaths. Hugh, please let me take this shite off. Oh, great, that's nice. Beg your enemy for a little break. Bastard, I can't breathe. Hugh sighed a frustrated huff. He put down his blunted longsword and took off his helmet. He remembered the first time he wore his armor in battle. He was much older than 13. Sod it all, just take it off. Meredith collapsed onto the ground and rolled to her back. She threw off her helmet and gasped for air. How can anyone fight like this? Hugh was lost in memory. He looked at Meredith on the ground with unfocused eyes. A grim look washed over his face as he returned to the present. It's easier to fight with armor than with holes in your chest. Meredith knew what was coming. Hugh was slipping into an unending lecture about his own experiences and how Meredith would need to remember all he taught her. Her least favorite parts of his lectures came at the end, when he would remind her not to fight her enemies, but to kill them. Meredith sat up and began to unbuckle her brother's old breastplate. She stayed quiet for fear of providing an opening for Hugh to continue his lecture. It was too late. Hugh loved to tell Meredith stories, but none more than the limited tales of his own heroics. Meredith humored her brother as he droned on. Do you remember when Da and I rode north 2 years ago? It was a month after your 12th birthday. He didn't pause for an answer. We'd been arguing for days about what to do. MacDonald had invaded Ross and taken Dingwall Castle. Then he marched across Moray with no resistance. That's what done it for us. The Spalding clan is a septive clan, Meredith, and we will nae stand for anyone to ride roughshod over our kin. Sir Alexander Ogilvy, the Sheriff of Angus, called our banners, and so we rode north with the knights and nobles of Angus to meet with the Earl of Mar. We joined forces in late July and marched to halt MacDonald's advance before he came to Aberdeen. Meredith was still taking off her armor. Hugh stopped talking to help her with the final few straps. They came undone easily enough, and the breastplate slipped off. Meredith saw in Hugh's face that he was desperate to finish the story, and she took pity on him. Meredith had heard every one of Hugh's stories before, but she knew he had no one else to tell. Peter was fighting alongside Hugh in that battle, and would have recounted the story to at least a dozen times. Meredith suddenly realized that her brother's existence was also supremely lonely. She'd never thought about if Hugh had friends or how he spent his time. Then, for the briefest moment, Meredith felt an overwhelming shame. In her own misery, she'd never considered her brother's life and his lack of meaningful choices. Hugh would never disobey his father or do anything to dishonor his name. Meredith thought about how much time Hugh had spent with her as a child, and how much time he'd told her about their mother. As even now, Hugh was training her in the armor he'd worn at her age, and she loved him for it. Meredith knew she would regret this. "All right, gone," she sighed. "Tell me about Hardlaw." Hugh broke into a wide smile. He picked up the blunted longsword to lean on and use as a prop in the telling. Meredith would have laughed if she weren't so exhausted, and she thought to herself, men must love drama. Meredith leaned forward to appear interested and smiled at her brother's passing joy. There were more than 3,000 men marching with the Earl. The clan chiefs rode at the head of the column, but Da and I rode in the rear guard, watching for any raid on our baggage train. Right, I know this part. Meredith puffed up her chest to imitate her brother. Her accent became a caricature. There were nary a clan missing from the force. Each man knew the stakes of the battle to come. A forced march of 30 miles a day until we finally came to Benaki. Are you finished? It's important to tell the good stories, Meredith. You might tell your children someday. Meredith smirked. She went on. Donald of Islay often spoke about the burning the port at Aberdeen, and now he was only a day's march away. We saw his 10,000 islanders camped on the high ground, and the Earl split us up into battle formations. All right, I was just poking fun. Go on, tell me what happened. Hugh could never get through a story without Meredith making fun of him for telling it the same way each time. She was finally done, though, and Hugh set the scene. The Earl of Mar divided the army into the van, the main array, and the reserve. The Earl placed all his favored knights and clan chiefs in the vanguard, and for the main force of the infantry, the Earl created 3 schildrums of pikemen. You see, Meredith, a schildrum is like a wall of soldiers grouped shoulder to shoulder. Many cultures have their own forms of this. The Vikings call it the shield wall. The Greeks call it the phalanx. The schildrum was at first a great circular formation of 1,000 immobile spearmen. But after the Bruce defeated the English at Bannockburn, we Scots learned rectangular schildrums so we could march and attack in formation. Meredith broke in. So you and Daff fought with the brave knights of the van? No. Most men who fight in the vanguard never get a second chance, if you catch my meaning. Meredith thought she saw a tinge of timidity. So you didn't fight in the van because you're afraid to die? She had touched on a point Hugh wasn't ready to make, but couldn't tell if he didn't want to talk about it or if he'd wish he'd fought in the van. If you would just listen, you might learn something, and he mumbled under his breath, instead of accusing me of cowardice. Meredith didn't know she could put her older brother on the defensive so quickly. She made a mental note of his vulnerability and made a face to show she was ready again to listen. Hugh still felt the need to explain himself. The thing about the vanguard, Meredith, is that it's usually only for horsemen. These men, they charge recklessly into the fray with no care for their lives. They're very brave, true, but even when the battle is won, the men of the van are killed or wounded. The knights and lords that have been fighting in France for ages have perfect armor and expect to be ransomed if they're captured. In the islands, In the Highlands, men don't care about ransoms because they've come to kill you. Da and I prefer to fight on foot because we can give a better account of ourselves. We joust on occasion, but our claymores aren't useful on horseback. More importantly, jousting against one knight and charging into thousands of men aren't the same. Sheriff Ogilvy knew our clan and gave Da command of the left Shieldrum, so we were needed in the main force anyway. At Harlaw, we had a vanguard of only 1,000 horse knights and men-at-arms. Well, how big was MacDonald's van? He didn't have a van, because his army was made of Highlanders on foot. There must have been close to 10,000 men wielding axes and carrying targe shields. Have you ever seen a targe before? It's a small shield with a spike in the center. I've not seen one, but it sounds useful. Where was I? Right, there were some bowmen amongst them, but most were eager to get up close to us. When MacDonald saw our force advance, the first wave of Donald's Highlanders flew down at us. The Earl of Mar was commanding our forces from the reserve, and he chose to divide up our vanguard. These 500 men and horses separated into two groups and rode to either side of the battle. MacDonald's army shot at them with what bows they had, but his focus was ever on our Shieldrums. Just as the vanguard had separated, the first group of his army ran right into our pikes. Da and I held the left flank as our disorganized enemy impaled themselves on the pike formations. Meredith, it was beautiful and horrible. Men shouted war cries as they rushed on, and their cries turned to screams for their mothers in the din of battle. At first the combat was butchery. Da and I counted 12 heads between our blades after the first wave, but more came and more kept coming. MacDonald's forces seemed unending, and many of our men fell during the second wave. Our flanks held firm, but now we were locked in a vicious struggle that could only be cured with death, for them or for us. It was the first time Meredith had heard this story since she'd taken a life. She hadn't remembered it as well as she had thought, but her favorite part was coming. Hugh seemed to grow taller as he sang the song of his own glory. And then the Earl of Mar gave the signal to the divided vanguard. From the edges of the battle, the sheriff, his knights, and the clan chiefs spurred their horses and charged into the oncoming third wave of MacDonald's men. To be quite honest, I was too busy defending myself to have a clear view of the charge, but I know what happened. 500 horsemen charging into closely packed infantry would be devastating, Meredith, but these men did not look to come home from this fight. In their fury, the van rode over scores of men until each one lost his horse or was thrown from it. When a man is thrown from his horse, he's not long for this world. The whole of the battlefield became a chaotic melee where Scot killed Scotsmen, and in the brawl, all but a few of the vanguard were slain, including our proud sheriff. Their work was finished, and their faithfulness saved our lives. Soon, we were rewarded by the sight of Donalds, who were not already fighting, fleeing the field and leaving their comrades to their fate. We were still outnumbered, but the unarmored Highlanders fled for their lives or became carrion for crows. And as the sun went down, we honored our dead and made camp on the field, expecting to renew fighting the next day. But in the night, they retreated to Ross, and then finally back to their islands. Meredith thought Hugh never looked prouder than he did at that moment. The Battle of Harlaw was one of the 2 legitimate battles that Hugh ever fought in, and it meant a great deal to him. The way he talked about the vanguard made Meredith think he wished it was in it. Still, there was something odd about his account. Hugh, why don't you mention Da much during the story? Well, he was right beside me the whole time. All right, but you didn't say much about what the 2 of you actually did during the battle. The same grim look came over Hugh's face. His eyes went wide as he relived the experience, and Meredith found his voice unrecognizable. Because we killed them, Meredith. Da and I, in our plate armor and with our claymores, we thrashed them and cursed them with every breath. We were berserk. No man who faced us lived to tell. Meredith looked shocked and her skin paled as Hugh maintained his rancorous line of thought. We did not take a single prisoner. Not a one. Being outnumbered like that, we just couldn't take the chance of being overwhelmed. Remember that, Meredith. When your enemies come forward to fight you, you kill them. Meredith returned to form. She rolled her eyes and mocked him. You didn't fight your enemies, you killed them. How many times have you and Da said that? Then Hugh smiled and laughed at a secret joke. Meredith didn't like being laughed at. What the fuck is so funny, you bastard? You are! What? The night you didn't come home from the woods? You think those two boys were never found? But Meredith didn't blush. She put her hands on her hips and laughed at the same joke. I guess I didn't fight them, huh? Nay, you killed them. He paused for a beat. And you're still here for it. Do you know why Da always says that? Meredith was sure it was for the obvious reason, but played along. Tell me. After the Black Death, there were few Spaldings left, and they were scattered to the wind. Still, Scotland called for our swords, and we answered with blood. Da saw his kin die from unworthy wars and disease, Meredith, and he died inside sometime after you were born. He reminds us because there are too many fucking things trying to kill us all the time, so when enemies come to hurt us, we make sure they can't do it again. Meredith was unimpressed. She was a huntress and preferred the thrill of the chase. Waiting is for prey. That's stupid. We should kill our enemies before they come to us. We should kill them where they live. We should burn them in their beds. Christ almighty, Meredith. They're our enemies, aren't they? Fuck them. Shut up. Put your breastplate back on, girl. Hugh helped Meredith put the armor and helm back on. He wanted to tell her that she looked foolish in his old suit. She didn't. The truth was that she fit better in it than he ever did. Peter had the armor made for Hugh when he was 14, but Meredith moved well in the old gray suit and filled it out. There was still some time in the day for getting her used to the feel of fighting with the weight of metal on her shoulders. It was barely 2 weeks till the tourney, and Meredith would need to enter the page's melee as a boy. The coif in her helmet would cover her hair well enough, so Hugh figured he could sign up Mark Spalding as Peter Spalding's second son in this page. Hugh didn't think his father would care because he would be too busy with Elise or some local horse. The page's melee wasn't the best event, but it was a peasant favorite, and Hugh was sure Meredith could win it. They continued sparring and training until the sunset. Hugh woke Meredith up the next morning, and together they trained every day for the tourney. Hugh could feel it when he was sparring with Meredith. She was ready. In her armor, she was quick and lost no power in her swings. Hugh would still best her in every match between them, but the bouts became closer and closer as the tourney approached. Meredith had something very important left to learn, though. When it was a week until the tourney, Hugh brought 2 horses from the stables into the courtyard. All right, Meredith, today you're going to learn to ride. Think you're up for it? She was, and she lifted herself onto the saddle. She put her feet in the stirrups and gave the chestnut bay a kick to the haunches. Hugh tried to stop her. Wait just a damn minute! But it was too late. The horse's reflexes were apt, and then Meredith was speeding down the drive before she knew it. She felt like she was flying. The wind blew her hair back, and Meredith was wide-eyed and alive. Hugh leapt onto the other horse to chase after her. Suddenly, Meredith realized she didn't know how to stop the horse, and her only option was to hold on for dear life. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Meredith screamed. She was coming up on the town, and the horse was yet to slow. Hugh was egging on his nag to catch up. He shouted to her, "Pull back on the reins!" But Meredith couldn't hear him over the sound of her own screaming. The people near the edge of town started to panic at the oncoming horsewoman of the apocalypse. They jumped out of the way as Meredith held on to the horse with all her might. Soon after, Hugh followed her into Bellerty and continued shouting to Meredith to pull back on the reins. Meredith finally heard him, and in the heart of the settlement, she tugged the reins towards her as hard as she could. The horse reacted quickly and slowed faster than Meredith expected. The chestnut bay reared back on their hind legs, and Meredith screamed, "Shite!" Hugh could see the whole thing and cursed himself for simply handing her a horse. Meredith fell from her mount and into a puddle of mud. The horse, free of Meredith's weight, trotted around the mud puddle to add insult to injury. Hugh stopped his gray nag right next to Meredith as she wallowed in the mud. She was moaning something unintelligible while Hugh grabbed the reins of both horses. Meredith caused quite a commotion in the normally quiet farming town. People were gathered all around to see the spectacle, but Hugh tried to shoo them away. She's fine, she's fine. Thank you for your concern. Go about your business. Most of the people that were gathered around dispersed quickly enough, but a short brunette woman with a pixie haircut walked swiftly over to Hugh to share a secret with him. She whispered in his ear and in an Irish accent, and his eyes darted. Hugh looked at Meredith, who was recovering from her daze. Between her mud-covered legs, there was a blood stain that started at the top of the front of her linen hose and moved down Meredith's right leg. Hugh was terrified. He had not experience with the menstrual cycle and was afraid their father would seek a marriage for Meredith immediately. Then he had a desperate idea. He turned to the young woman. She had tan skin and dark eyes, but her arms had many grotesque bruises that her green smock didn't cover. Hugh was troubled by her bruises, but he was too worried for Meredith. Lass, do you have a place where we could take her inside? She needs to be looked after for a moment. Aye, my lord, it's this way. She pointed to a group of thatched domiciles. Hugh handed the horses' reins to her and walked to Meredith. He was thankful Meredith wasn't injured from the fall, but his distress was the crimson stain on her hose. He tried to cover the stain by splashing some more mud on her, and then he scooped her up from the mud and carried her over to the horses. Put me down, I'm fine, shite! Shut up, girl, your flowers just bloomed. Oh, no. Da canny no, Meredith. You're gonna stay with this lovely lady until I figure out what to do. Meredith was still limp in Hugh's arms, but she lifted her head and said to the brunette pixie, Hello, I'm Meredith. Hugh, would you put me down? Not yet. We need to get you inside before someone else sees something they shouldn't. The brunette woman responded to Meredith. A pleasure to meet you, milady. My name is Ellen. Then Hugh realized he was being rude. Thank you for your help, Ellen. I'm Hugh Spaulding. I know who you are, my lord. It's a great lord to lend a hand. It's a great honor to lend a hand. Ellen led the horses and Hugh as he carried Meredith. Then she tied the horses to a post close to her humble home and showed the Spaulding siblings inside. Ellen opened the door to what amounted to a small hut. She entered and was followed by Hugh, who carried Meredith over the threshold and then placed her on her feet. There was no floor to the house, but Ellen had a table with 2 chairs and a small bed made of straw. Hugh's chest was covered in mud from where he held Meredith, and he was preoccupied with it. Meredith didn't know why she was surprised the inside of the house was as small as the outside. She was still a bit concussed, but her sense of humor came back to her before anything. So, give us the tour, Meredith chided as she sat down in one of the chairs. Hugh was mortified. This poor woman had offered her assistance with no hope for remuneration. To his delight, Ellen laughed. It was a sweet, innocent lark. Hugh thought how his mother's laugh sounded just like that, and then he remembered that his mother was Irish too. Ellen sat down at the table and began Meredith's tour in good fun. She pointed to her table. This is where I eat slop each night, and the fireplace that keeps my ass warm. Then she pointed to her bed. And that's where I entertain me guests. Meredith loved this. She kept it going. Well, what about the roof? You mean the one that leaks bird shit? What about the floor? That's where I catch my breakfast. The worms crawl right up to me. Meredith found herself howling with laughter, even if she was still lightheaded. Hugh wasn't just laughing. He was enthralled with this beauty. He was gazing at her with a soft smile, but then she made eye contact with him, and he realized how long he'd been staring. He reached for words, failed to grasp them, and then he retreated. Well, I'll let you get to know one another and deal with the situation. I'll need to return the horses and figure out what to do. Thank you kindly for your hospitality, Ellen. Meredith forgot why she was there for a spell and hated the reminder. Her face twisted from a smile to a scowl. Ellen smiled to Hugh as he quickly turned and left. She thought he was handsome and kind, but most importantly, he cared for his sister. Ellen turned back to Meredith. She was sitting across from Ellen with her arms crossed and look of dread on her face. Ellen liked Meredith's high cheekbones and her straight red hair. She noticed Meredith's astounding muscle tone. It was clear from the circumstances that Meredith was only just becoming a woman, but Ellen was struck by how developed she already was. Will you stand up, Meredith? I should have a look at you. Meredith remembered that she'd been thrown from a horse along with her now monthly mishap. So some medical concern was proper. She stood from the table and saw the mud she'd covered her chair in. Suddenly, embarrassment from the whole scene in the town with the mud on the chair washed over her. She fully grasped that she was now a woman, and her father would use her for the clan's gain. What is there to gain, she thought. Meredith had been mulling over the Spaulding clan's history recently, and concluded there was something dubious about the whole story. She set it aside when she noticed the bruises on Ellen's arms. What the fuck happened to you? Oh, it was a week or so ago. Forget about it. Ellen, is someone hurting you? Ellen looked knowingly at Meredith. Well, they can't hurt me anymore. You made sure of that. Meredith banged her hands on the small table between them. Those rotten bastards got you, didn't they? Why didn't you kill them? What's important is that you did. The women of this town treasure you, milady. You don't know how much it means to us that they got what was coming to them. Meredith was enraged by this news. The thought of those cretins pinning Ellen or any woman down and robbing her dignity made Meredith want to kill them all over again. She had one question, though. Does everyone think it was me that done it? Ellen replied with a wink. Not everyone. Just certain people who know too much. I hope to pay them back myself, but wouldn't know the first thing about it. Consider your honor avenged. Anyway, you're Irish, aren't you? Why do you live here in Angus? Ellen's eyes cast downward. Her slender shoulders slumped in her green smock. She looked back up to Meredith and answered, I got separated from the family a few years back. We lived in Waterford. Mum and Dad wanted to be free of English oppression, and Scotland was the only chance to avoid the king's taxes and still live among our own people, or close enough. Meredith understood that well enough. All her father and brother ever truly agreed upon was their hatred for the English. Since William the Conqueror won at Hastings, English royalty and nobility had been expansionistic, and their principal victims were the Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. Scotland was the only place in the British Isles where denizens could live in relative freedom, or lawlessness. The combination of Celtic Catholicism and Germanic myth and militarism created the hardy Norse Gaels and Celtic peoples of Scotland and Ireland. And there in that little home with a mud floor, Meredith and Ellen became fast friends of unlikely circumstance. Ellen taught Meredith everything a woman should know about how her body works, and Meredith was supremely grateful she didn't have to learn any of this from Elise. Meredith had been dreading this day for ages and was sure Elise would run to Peter with glad tidings of Meredith's womanhood and begin the process of marrying her off to some barbaric bastard with a beard. He would have a beard. She knew and loathed it. The idea of some scratchy-bearded Scotsman like her father made Meredith physically ill. Then horror dawned on her. Oh, shite. Da will be looking for my husband at the tourney. All right, guys. That is 3 chapters of my book, Shield Sister, by me, John Major Spaulding, but you can call me Jack. I'm gonna take some questions now. If anybody's got some, if anybody's still here, let's see. I can't even. Hi there. Hi guys. Okay. Yeah. So I don't want to read anymore because I don't want to spoil too much. But let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll see if I can read the comments or whatever is happening. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I had a good time reading it to you, although my mouth is hella parched. Well, I don't think we have any questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. But thank you guys for tuning in. Those of you who did, I really appreciate the support. Hope you buy Shield Sister on Amazon or the TikTok shop. Thanks, guys.